You are listening to The Dark Past, a history podcast all about some of the most horrific, unethical, and downright awful events in our past. I cover the topics they don't teach you in school and the stuff that is buried deep within the dark pages of history. Hello, my name is Katie and I am your host. Thank you so much for joining me. Pre-warning, this episode may be slightly difficult for some to listen to. It deals with themes of sexual abuse and suicide, so therefore it won't be suitable for everyone. Today we are going to be talking about the tragic life of David Reimer and a medical experiment that is so messed up. So first, to understand the story, let's go back to the 1950s, before David Reimer was even born. Before the 1950s, not much was known about those who were born intersex, and knowledge surrounding topics like gender and sex were limited. In this day and age, we are far more inclusive of people who are transgender and part of the LGBTQ+ community. We still have a long way to go, but it has dramatically improved over the last 5 or 6 decades. Sadly, during this time, people did not have the education needed to understand how others could be born and not fit the norm, whatever that may be. The 1950s seemed to be a turning point for understanding gender and sex. A handful of doctors decided to make it their mission to start exploring it in more depth. Throughout this episode, you will hear that sex and gender are blended into one. I'd like to make it clear that during this time there was not a lot of knowledge on the differences between gender and sex, as it was only just being discovered. In hindsight, we can look back and wonder, how did they not realise there was a distinct difference between the two? But it was all very new to them back then. In the 1950s, at the Johns Hopkins University, they developed something called the optimum gender of rearing system. Their way of treating a child with intersex was to basically pick a sex for the child so that it was defined earlier on. Nowadays, if there is confusion over a child's sex, doctors will run many different tests to try and determine the child's biological sex before they make a decision. Yet, decades ago, they just assumed picking a child's sex for them would somehow make it easier for the child growing up. I presume this is so that it would avoid confusion, in their eyes anyway. The idea of gender and sex was very black and white during the time we are looking at. The aim was that a child would grow up without questioning the gender they had been assigned, and that they would just learn to adjust to it. John Money, a lead psychologist at the university, believed that gender was about nurture. In short, he basically believed that you could make any child the sex you wanted to if you made their bodies look right before the age of 18 months. You also had to have the parents fully on board, convincing them that their child was a specific sex, even with no scientific evidence. John Money later becomes a key figure when we look at this medical case, and for all the wrong reasons, as he was certainly a peculiar character. The university team warned that you should always tell a child when they reach an appropriate age about their biological sex. But in fact, many doctors lied to parents in the first place. Surgeons would perform cosmetic genital surgeries on children who were born intersex without their parents' consent or even knowledge. They believed it would be more effective this way. Endocrinologists, those who help people with hormonal imbalances, would manipulate a patient's hormones to try and get their body to look the way it should. For example, if the medical team had decided somebody was a girl, they would simply pump their body with more estrogen, hoping this would help their body become more womanly in the future. So that leads us on to David Reimer. He was born in Canada on August 22nd, 1965, alongside his twin brother. He was originally born as Bruce Reimer, and you'll later see why this changed. Sadly, the two twins started showing signs that they were having trouble urinating, and this was due to something called phimosis. Now, I'm not a doctor, but I'm going to try and explain to you what this is. Phimosis occurs when the foreskin of the penis cannot stretch to allow it to be pulled back past the glands. David's parents took him and his brother, who was 7 or 8 months old at this time, to get their penises circumcised. They were hoping this would fix the problem. David, who was known as Bruce, went in for his operation first. It was done via a burning method, rather than using a blade, which I imagine would give more precision. His mother explains in an interview that they had turned the temperature all the way up and it had left the skin literally sizzling. The machine malfunctioned several times and eventually, Bruce, who later became David, actually had his penis burnt off as a result of the operation going terribly wrong. As you can imagine, his parents were incredibly upset and decided not to get his twin brother circumcised because of what he went through. So it's important to note here that Reimer was not actually born intersex. He was in fact born, biologically, as a boy. So now we are introduced to Dr. John Money again. Janet Reimer had seen Dr. Money on TV, where he was talking about his ideas of gender and sex. She was really interested in what he was talking about, so the parents went to see Money after they had become increasingly concerned about David's future as a man with no penis. Money invited them to Johns Hopkins, where he carried out his extensive research. He managed to persuade the parents to bring David up as a girl because of his keen interest in the idea of nature versus nurture. He basically wanted to put this theory to the test. Now, you're probably wondering why the parents went along with this, and that's a good question. But try to imagine you are in their shoes. It's the 1960s. Not much is known in terms of psychological effects of an experiment like this. It's important to note as well that, since David's accident, the family were living in fear. They did not want to leave the house or the children on their own, because they didn't trust anybody else with David. They did not like the idea of somebody looking after him and potentially seeing what had happened to the little baby. They were scared that they would gossip and people would soon know about his situation. It would have been incredibly difficult for the parents to go against Dr. Money too, as they were following the guidance of a doctor. He was also apparently an expert in this field. Dr. Money was a very charming and charismatic man too. He managed to convince the family that if they just didn't tell him that he was born a male, and convinced him he was a girl, he would go along with it and never question it. Janet said this on the matter.
The doctors at Johns Hopkins were very hopeful that if we had made a move towards making our Bruce into a girl, she could be successfully raised as a girl, and she would enjoy a more normal life than if she remained a boy.
So, with everyone on board to change David into a girl, they went ahead and operated on him. He was just 18 months old. And you will remember me saying at the beginning of the episode, 18 months was the absolute cutoff when it came to changing a child's sex. They castrated him, giving him a vulva in place of his penis. The family then started to call him Brenda and were to treat him as if he were a little girl. Bearing in mind, Dr. Money had never done anything like this on anybody before, so he used David as his experiment, basically. Here he had 2 children, twins in fact, both biologically a male, but what was special for Dr. Money was that he could make a comparison between the 2 children. Apparently David's mother would write to Dr. Money about Brenda's progress, and the family would often take a trip to see him in America. Throughout this episode, I will not refer to David as her or Brenda, unless we are talking about quotes. This is because David was his chosen name, and I want to be respectful of this. So Dr. Money would document the case of David, and basically kept a record of his progress as Brenda. It was known as the John Joan case, and his identity was kept a secret. David did not know he was, in fact, the inspiration behind the John Joan case until decades later. Dr. Money had extensive knowledge on the ideas of gender and sex. However, he was exceptionally peculiar in his views. He actually defended paedophilia, claiming that the public and researchers can't distinguish the difference between a paedophile that is just affectionate and one that is sadistic, stating, "If I were to see the case of a boy aged 10 or 11 who's intensely erotically attracted toward a man in his 20s or 30s, if the relationship is totally mutual and the bonding is genuinely totally mutual, then I would not call it pathological in any way." So, right away, this quote gives you an understanding of the type of man Money was. David and his brother were forced to go to Dr. Money's office for therapy sessions when they visited him in America, But these therapy sessions were far from that. Money once again used this as an opportunity to explore this experiment he wanted to create. He would show the two children sexually explicit pictures, which was apparently essential to his experiment. David recalled as Brenda, he got yelled at by Money to take his clothes off. He stood there and refused. But after being fearful of being met with physical abuse, he eventually did take his clothes off. Money apparently made David get on all fours on his office sofa, and then made his twin brother come up behind him on his knees and place his crotch against his buttocks. Money referred to this as sexual rehearsal play. The two young boys were subjected to humiliation every time they went to the office, in an attempt to become part of an experiment. What's even worse is the fact that in 1975, Dr. Money published a paper detailing his observations, and he claimed the experiment had been a total success. He reported, "Her behaviour is so normally that of an active little girl, and so clearly different by contrast from the boyish ways of her twin brother, that it offers nothing to stimulate one's conjectures." David grew up absolutely hating dressing up in girls' clothes. When he reached his teens, he had attempted suicide at least once already. When David grew up as Brenda, he was very lonely, with his mother saying this, "I could see that Brenda wasn't happy as a girl," Janet recalled. "She was very rebellious, she was very masculine, and I could not persuade her to do anything feminine. Brenda had almost no friends growing up. Everybody ridiculed her, called her a cave woman. David was treated so differently from the other children. His brother Brian remembers he was not able to go to the girls' bathroom because other girls would pull knives out at him. And he couldn't go to the boys' bathroom either, so he had to go to the toilet outside just to be able to go without being ridiculed." It seemed that David had this innate feeling that he was a boy, yet was being told he wasn't by everyone he knew, which confused him so much. Here is a snippet of David in an interview explaining this.
"I never quite fit in. Well, the girls would do their things with their Barbies and things like that, and that wouldn't interest me. Mm-hmm. And things such as trucks and building forts and, getting into the odd fist fight and climbing trees, that's the kind of stuff that I like, but it was unacceptable, so I'd never...
As a girl?
As a girl, I had...
David refused further surgery at the age of 13 and threatened to commit suicide if he had to see Dr. Money again. He did, however, consent to taking estrogen supplements to encourage the development of breasts. Soon, Dr. Money had become an absent figure in David's life, but David remained under constant psychiatric treatment. One night, David's father confessed everything to his son. Perhaps seeing him feel such a way about his identity led him to have feelings of guilt. And with this, David was suddenly aware of his true identity. This was the turning point for David, who always knew something didn't feel right about being Brenda. That is when he took the decision to opt for a sex change, in order to become a man, who of course we know is called David. David tried to put the past behind him, and he went on to get married and worked in a slaughterhouse. Eventually, in the late 1990s, David went public with the experiment in order to try and discourage people from performing such operations and experiments. He wanted his life to be a lesson for others. He even had an article about his life written for the Rolling Stones magazine. In 2000, John Colapinto released a biography about David, and it became a New York Times bestseller. The book was titled, As Nature Made Him, The Boy Who Was Raised a Girl. David also completely forgave his mother and father, who were in an absolutely impossible position. He believed they were just trying to do the best thing for him, and they had no ill intentions. Tragically, his twin brother Brian committed suicide. This was reportedly due to an overdose of drugs he was taking for schizophrenia. David had a deep sense of guilt over his brother's suicide, and he would visit his grave on a daily basis. I think these emotions got the better of him. 2 years later, David had committed suicide too, at the age of 38. What's even worse is that Dr. Money was never held accountable for his actions. He died in 2016 without ever really being affected by David's story. And that is the sad, sad case of David Reimer. Whilst doing research for this particular episode, I actually came across some really horrible titles, such as The Boy with No Penis. It made me really sad to see that journalists put their focus on this, instead of focusing on the doctor and the terrible actions he participated in. There's no doubt in my mind that David carried round these feelings with him for his entire life, and I therefore wanted to share some resources with you in case you're affected by this episode. www.dsdfamilies.org is an information and peer support charity for families in the UK. They work with families and their children, teens or young adults, or anybody who falls under the DSD umbrella. And if you go to www.interactadvocates.org/resources/intersex organisations, you will find there is a whole lot of information on people who are advocates for intersex youth. Thank you so much for listening, and I will catch up with you in the next episode.